everybody. Many thanks for finding the time and finding your way as well to this fabulous auditorium here at King's. It's our first link up with King's University, so we're absolutely delighted to be here this evening. And we've got a fabulous panel. So I'm going to start by introducing your chair for the evening, Professor Stephen Geary from King's University, and then Steve is going to introduce the panel. This is the latest in a long line of panel debates that we've had, certainly over the years at King's, at LSE, and this is our first home here at our new academic sponsors, King's College London. We're going to have a look at that thorny and hugely topical issue of gender-based reporting this evening, so I'm sure we're in for a really lively and interesting debate. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Stephen Geary, and Steve's going to introduce our esteemed panel to this evening.
Thank you, Guy. And thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure for us at King's to be associated with the London HR Connection. We have a very successful and large MSc program in Human Resource Management, and one of the largest groups in the Business School teaches Human Resource Management for organisation behaviour. So we're very pleased to be linking up with you, and next time we see you we'll probably have many more of our students here, so we'll fill up the rest of the anatomy lecture theatre. There used to be dead bodies wheeled out here, as you probably realise. We've got a group of live speakers here tonight. Depending on your reaction, hopefully they won't end up where the bodies used to. We've got four speakers, obviously one academic and three practitioners. I'm going to start off with the academic, as we should, of course. And our first speaker is Professor Janet Walsh, who's a Professor of Human Resource Management here at King's. She's worked for a number of years in the area of gender. She's done a recent study of female lawyers and career development and flexibility, a very large survey that she conducted. And she's been at King's for, about 10 years, Janet? Prior to that, at Melbourne, Leeds, Cambridge, and Royal Holloway. So I think Janet's going to start the ball rolling with some factual information. Thanks, Janet.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. And it's great to talk to you today. And I think this is a really, fantastic connection that we've got with the London HR connection between King's and so on. Yes, I'm here, I think, to provide the kind of academic context to this, to say a little bit about academic research in the area. I should say, first of all, that I think that gender pay gap reporting can galvanise organisations to review their pay systems and human resource policies in a way that can obviously be beneficial to women. And this is happening in actually my own sector at the moment. I don't know if any of you noticed, but there was a big press report last week about the fact that Essex University actually raised the pay of its female professors by on average £4,000 to reduce the female gender pay gap. And I have to say there was a little bit of naming and shaming of my own institution in that press article about its rather large gender pay gap. The question that I'd like to pose today is whether gender pay gap statistics are really fit for purpose. And I'd like to quote Nikki Morgan, the Secretary of State for Equalities, who said at Deloitte's in February, one of the biggest myths and often a source of confusion is around what we even mean by the gender pay gap. Too many still conflate this with equal pay. And she's right, of course, although she then proceeded to introduce mandatory gender pay gap reporting. There are real problems with the way in which statistics around the gender pay gap are used. I mean, people now talk often that women in the UK earn on average 20% less than men. But the gender pay gap is not synonymous with equal pay. Often we're not talking about pay for men and women doing the same work or in the same job grades. And I note with interest that Deloitte's published its gender pay gap and stated it was 17.8%, but when they actually looked at men and women in the same job grade, this shrank to 1.5%. And academic work takes this further because often academics will take account of gender differences in work experience and productivity and then we find that the gender pay gap can almost be eliminated. So when people argue that reporting with a gender pay gap assists transparency, I personally find that a little bit of a strange argument, because a statistic is only helpful if we know what it is measuring precisely, what it reflects, and we often don't, at least not fully. And this is, I think, really important, because what the government seems to be talking about is the capacity to name and shame employers. And if we're going to name and shame employers, we need to know what we're naming and shaming them about, because there's quite a lot of reputational risk here. Now, some academics are actually quite sceptical about gender pay gap reporting, and that includes my own colleague, Professor Alison Wolfe, who sits in the House of Lords, and she gave evidence to the House of Commons Women and Equalities Committee on the gender pay gap in December 2015. And she argued this. She said, focusing on pay comparisons within an individual company does not help anyone to understand the social and economic forces which create different labour markets and pay structures for men and women, and very different ones for highly educated women compared to other women. Having said that, I think it is actually useful to look and take apart the gender pay gap for full-time women and for part-time women. And some organisations are doing that. When we look at the full-time gender pay gap, it's actually only 9.4%. It's the lowest it's ever been since 1997. And actually the gender pay gap has been almost completely eliminated for women under the age of 40. It's actually negative for young women aged 20 to 29. And there's actually, I think, a really positive story here. And this is to do with women's investments in education, in professional training, and their entry into the professions in particular. Women now make up something like 50% of solicitors in Britain, and that's compared to something like 8% in the early 1980s. Women now outnumber men on university campuses. Indeed, The Guardian, I think last year, ran an article talking about the gender gap in universities, and it wasn't talking about the gap in terms of women, it was talking about, where are all the men? And this worries universities quite a lot. At the same time, women's job tenure and their cumulative work experience has increased relative to men's too. Academics think that these developments are actually really profound, and some economists, including a very influential Harvard economist, talks about the fact that this is one of the biggest social and economic advances we witnessed in the last century. But earnings differences between highly educated women and men can still be found, so we have to ask the question, why? And here I think it's really useful to drill down to individual occupations. And there's been some very interesting academic work that's focused on men and women with MBAs. And this data comes from the University of Chicago, the Booth School of Business, which is an elite business school in America. And academics have tracked what happens to male and female MBAs over the period from 1990 to 2006, so it's a long time period. And what they found is that over time, their earnings started to diverge, despite the fact that after they graduated with MBAs, they had almost identical incomes and worked almost identical hours. Why? Well, this reflected the fact that women had more career interruptions than men, which meant they had less accumulated job experience, and they worked on average shorter hours, including more work in part-time positions and self-employment. And this, unsurprisingly, was associated with the presence of children, particularly the first child. A lot of changes took place at that time, and women, MBA women, started then to search for more family-friendly employment. Now, the important thing about this is it led to substantial declines in income for MBA women. By 10 to 16 years out from their graduation, MBA men were earning something like 82% more than women on average, which is quite a staggering decline in pay for women. It's quite a disproportionate pay penalty. So I think that's quite interesting research. It isn't an artefact actually of the American labour market. I think some of you might be thinking, well, perhaps it's something peculiar to the US. You know, they have very poor parental leave policies. It's actually not simply unique to the US. There is actually a Swedish gender pay gap, particularly for highly qualified women, despite their incredibly good parental leave policies. Other research on full-time men and women has come up with a rather different explanation, and this time they looked at the gender pay gap among full-time university academics, in this case, interestingly, economists. And here a major explanation for the gender pay gap was that women actually received fewer outside job offers than men, even when they had comparable productivity. What appeared to be the case is that this history of outside job offers boosted men's salaries vis-à-vis women. And researchers speculate why this might be the case. Is it the fact that women's caring responsibilities are stopping them from seeking outside job offers? Is it the fact that women are more risk averse than men? They're not seeking outside job offers when they could be doing so? Or is it because they are less skilled and persistent negotiators about pay? So a variety of explanations there. So overall, the full-time gender pay gap is diminishing. Where a gap exists, there are various explanations put forward. It seems to reflect career interruptions, a reduction in weekly hours worked, and outside job offers. Now, of course, I haven't said anything about part-time women. And here, this is where the gender pay gap is most substantial for part-time women. Why? Well, the biggest explanation seems to be occupational segregation. Part-time women, it should be said actually that more women work part-time than men by a considerable degree, and they are in occupations which pay less than the occupations in which full-time women are in. So, for example, they dominate the ranks of care assistants, cleaners, shop assistants, personal service sales occupations. Now, there's a debate about why these occupations are paid less. Is women's work systematically undervalued because they're in caring roles? Is it because these jobs are not amenable to productivity growth? It would be very much an economist's perspective. Alternatively, are wages low because there's a trade-off going on here? Women trade off higher pay for more flexibility for shorter hours. It's a complicated issue. So, to sum up, the causes of the gender pay gap are complex and they're varied. There are different factors at play here for different women in different occupations, and there are structural differences. There seem to be well-defined male and female labour markets. There's a part-time pay penalty, there's occupational segregation, and there's the role of women's disproportionate caring responsibilities. And they complicate the interpretation of this broad brush statistic. Now, some academics, on the basis of this, have argued that these structural differences in women's and men's pay reflect social and economic forces and choices that lie well beyond the control of individual employers. And I'll kind of leave that point with you to think about. From my own perspective, I think perhaps for full-time women, the emphasis should be as much on genuine or trying to achieve genuine workplace flexibility and effective work-life policies as it is on pay. And interestingly, the House of Commons Committee on the Gender Pay Gap noted that flexible working for all lay at the heart of addressing the gender pay gap. And the work that I've done on female lawyers indicated that even when they made use of flexible working, they were overloaded with work, they were paid less but doing more than their contracted hours, and they perceived real career penalties. They felt that it was going to be very difficult for them to make the ranks of partnership, and particularly the ranks of equity partnership. For part-time women, we need to have a better understanding of the routes by which these women end up in low-paid part-time work. It may be that a pay intervention, the national living wage, will be positive here, as it might compress wages at the bottom end of the pay distribution and thereby reduce over time the part-time pay penalty, but that might be at the cost of female employment. So I think I want to leave it there with those thoughts and that academic work on the gender pay gap.
Thank you, Janet. Our next speaker is Chris Charman, who is a principal at Mercer, which the organisation itself has done an awful lot of work surveying organisations on the issue of gender pay. Chris has been involved with supporting clients on the challenge of the gender pay, and I think he's going to bring some further evidence from Mercer on survey work that they've done on it. So welcome, Chris.
Great, thank you very much.
You might want to bring the microphone along too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's the first time since I've been in a lecture theatre for about 25 years, so this is quite a treat. Thank you for the introduction, and I've spent about 20 years working as a reward practitioner, mostly as a consultant for Towers Watson and latterly for Mercer, and our role is a very privileged one to work with organisations and a whole variety of organisations and see inside what goes on. So I want to share with you some of my own perspectives on having done equal pay and gender pay work for the last 15 years or so, and give you an idea of that from the perspective of our own views as an organisation, but also from the kind of reward practitioner's perspective. Now, when we think about the gender pay gap reporting regulations, there is a difficult balance that's needed to be struck by the Government Equalities Office, who has developed the regulations. They've needed to balance the burden on business reporting. They've been very mindful of that, given that it's for 250 person organisations and above, with helping to support meaningful change. And let's be clear about what that is. To quote Nicky Morgan and the Prime Minister, that when they launched the initiative, the goal has been articulated to bring an end to the gender pay gap in a generation. Now, I would say, and I want to point out a few aspects in my own opinion about how that balance isn't kind of quite right at the moment, and it runs the risk very much of ending up being quite a compliance-driven exercise and not sufficiently helping to support the goals, which are more manifest than just producing statistics to be reported on. So the first point really is that the focus on pay is almost exclusively is unhelpful, and I think that echoes a number of your points, Janet. So a lot of the work that I get involved in is really understanding the detail of pay programs and looking at how those kind of contribute to the delivery of pay differences in genders. Now, it can be responsible for some of those issues, and I'll come to those in a moment, but most of the gender pay gap, as we've heard already, is caused by the lack of progression of women in their careers. It's the nature of the work that women do, and it's about talent flows, about attitudes in business to diversity and inclusion, and critically about unconscious bias. And that's about, let's not forget, that is, we like to use I like to think about this in saying that, you know, we're all guilty of that, and it's a natural thing. There isn't anything to blame in men or women around unconscious bias. We're primed to do that as human beings, but we need to overcome that to be able to deliver more talent and meritocratic outcomes, of course, for men and women. But, you know, there is a history to overcome in terms of the roles that men and women play in society, in work and in home. So indeed, as Janet was saying, the issue is complex and deep-rooted, and sorting out is much more about pay systems. Now, you know, within organisations themselves, obviously female careers and the roles they play and the segments in which they find themselves working is a critical piece. But when I've done the work around pay and reward programs, we find very much that it's discretion, which is actually a major driver where we see problems. It's issues about starting pay, pay for performance, bonuses, ad hoc pay decisions. I worked with one financial services company a few years ago where something like 35 to 40% of salaries were reviewed outside of the traditional annual pay cycles. I know Si to my right here as a pay practitioner will probably be quite aghast at those kind of numbers. So you know, why is that happening? And again, you know, why are those issues happening there? Why is that where we're seeing differences kind of come in? It's about unconscious bias, it's about poor governance, it's about a lack of frameworks within organisations to be able to manage that effectively. And what that is symbolic of is this larger issue, which is addressing one around behaviour and attitude. It's about managing managerial discretion and freedom, which has been the mantra of reward professionals for the whole time that I've been in the business, which is allowing them to do that, and actually that can be quite challenging. But by focusing on pay, it's quite narrow and has some real problems and effects. So reward professionals are effectively being handed a challenge which they can't solve, because it's mostly going to be around, as we said, diversity, inclusion and women's careers. And there's also kind of limited guides to these smaller companies and how to solve some of these issues and the way things are defined. Now, there is one good thing in the regulations, which it is doing quartile analysis, as you may know, which will give some sense of this distribution of women in the organisation. Now, like Janet as well, I hate the fact that we're agreeing so much, Janet, but the definition of pay certainly does not help. You talked about transparency. If you're familiar with the regulations, it really defines its earnings. It's based on the ASH definition. It's about base pay, bonus, long-term incentive, shift allowances, so on and so forth. So if you know anything about the distribution of those type of programs within an organisational context, then it's going to exacerbate things even worse in how it's measured. Critically, I think it being different from equal pay is unhelpful and confusing for organisations to practically do some things about it. So I think it's great for headlines, but it's practically not so useful. And I don't think organisations, in my experience and in research, are really understanding how much of a difference there is here. So I've just done some work with an organisation who thought, well, we're fine with an equal pay gap. We're 75% women. I did think that was a diversity problem in and of itself, but when we did the analysis, indeed they didn't have an equal pay problem, but they did have a gender pay gap larger than the norm. So these two things are two different pieces. But this type of measurement is very detached from actually how organisations operate pay programmes themselves. Now, we've just done a survey, and I'll tell you a few more statistics from that, but they used the three key words they used to describe that definition was burdensome, complex and illogical, and it was about 50-50 between whether they thought it was suitable at all. Now, I think the most important thing for me is that for organisations to do something about the gender pay gap, they need to understand what's going on in their organisations to effect meaningful change, to help people to understand that if you see in your organisation, and all organisations in my experience are not too bad actually around pay as large professional employers, and they certainly deny the fact that they would discriminate, but when you show them evidence that typically men are starting here and women are starting here because of negotiation typically, and there's good research to support that, it really does open eyes and manages to lead to meaningful change. So the way that organisations are structured at the moment, by trying to be too focused on a light regulatory regime, is that it's not providing this kind of insight to deliver change. So we've just done this survey of large FTSE 100, FTSE 250 organisations, 117 in total. The stats are hot off the press. They aren't even released back to the participants yet, so this is an exclusive for you. Now, these organisations typically with a market cap of about £1 billion. They're big, major employers. Now, you would expect these companies to be good at being underneath this and understanding what is driving their particular issues and concerns, because actually being good at the gender pay gap is also being effective about reward distribution in an organisation. You would be thinking it's the 250-person, 500-person organisation which is not so good, but they're not. They're not good at this at all. So we asked in the last 3 years what they've been up to, and actually about half of them have been doing something, but only about a third actually looked at workforce metrics. Only about 30% did equal pay audit, 26% did any workforce labour flow analysis, so looking at the flow of talent in an organisation, understanding hires and exits. So when you get down into the detail of pay programmes, less than half have looked at it. And then when you look at some of the simple stuff that they could measure, like starting pay or performance scores or how people are treated post-maternity, the numbers are very low indeed. So 22% of performance scores, 11% had done the simple analysis of looking at starting pay, and 3% had done some analysis to understand how women were treated after maternity against other cohorts in a similar situation. So I don't think that they're really understanding very clearly what's going on underneath this headline number, and the headline number certainly isn't going to help them to reach that. When we asked them about what they could do in the future, yes, there was more enthusiasm there, but again, it was the same thing. Lots of headline stuff that we have to do. When it's more detailed, under the bonnet, detailed analysis, pretty limited. And to actually get down to the fundamentals of change, 15th out of the 17th most popular action is to promote equality of access to parental leave. And I would agree with Janet's comments that, that kind of stuff is pretty fundamental. And I certainly believe that. I am a father of boys. I'm very conscious that gender stereotypes and until recently legislation have also impacted men's ability to be able to play a full role as parents, and so we shouldn't forget it cuts both ways. And I think there are plenty of men who feel that same way, that we're denied making choices as parents and workers in the same way that women are. So after 15 years of being involved in equal pay matters, I remain very concerned that although improved and there's more attention, which is great, the goal of ending the gender pay gap in a generation is merely headline grabbing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We'll now move on to our two practitioners who will be able to give us the under bonnet story that occurs in organisations. And the first of those two people is Cy Murray. Cy is the Global Head of Reward and HR Policy at Apollo Tyres. She's been involved in HR and reward for 25 years and been involved with organisations such as Sainsbury's, American Express and EDF Energy. So welcome, Cy, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen, and good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to talk about such an important topic. Before I start, though, I'll issue my usual disclaimer that many of the views that you hear this evening will be my own rather than my organisation's. And really, as Stephen's just introduced for me, they're based on my experience of being a British female in industry for a long time. And for about the last 13 years, I've been working as a compensation and benefits specialist. So I first came into contact with pay at quite a young age. I was 14. My mum and dad thought it was a good idea if I had a little job, and I was working at a greengrocer's, and I was on £1 an hour, which felt an awful lot then. But my friend Dawn, I was working next to, was on £1.25, and being a little naive, green round the ears 14-year-old, I couldn't understand why there was the difference. So I asked the boss, who it was his business, I said, why is it Dawn gets so much more than me? He said, well, she looks up on a Friday night and she brings the keys round to my house. So although I still felt aggrieved, at least I understood why. And I was very happy that when Dawn left and I stepped into her shoes, I suddenly got £1.25. So that's left me with a little bit of a lesson about talking to people, explaining things, transparency, and understanding what businesses value. And that little lesson has left itself with me all through my career. So my story about Dawn wasn't too long after the genesis of gender pay reporting. When the Equal Pay Act of 1970 was passed, things were very different then in society. The age of computers, the internet had not yet dawned. Women were being liberated from the home by labour-saving devices. Strikes, protest marches, struggle, weak governments, 3-day working week, civil unrest. Today's government is still struggling, however with a different set of more diverse and complex social issues. A broken society, poverty, ongoing inequality, substance abuse, terrorism, migration, the list goes on. And the causes of many of these social problems are unclear and or disputed. Things seem so much more simple in the 1970s. And evidence now shows that government's ability to influence behaviour is at best patchy. In my humble experience, changing behaviour is not linear or logical, especially when money is concerned. Change makes people feel uncomfortable, perhaps a little foolish, and often invokes a reaction to defend what is known, tried and tested. However, I contrast this where some recent legislation has had a positive effect. That I would cite, particularly in my arena, the pensions auto-enrolment and how that's improving people's save, and also about the minimum wage and raising the plimsoll line for everybody, bringing people out of poverty, irrespective of protected characteristic, which I think is probably my first lesson that I will draw on. I asked on a recent online poll of business professionals if they thought we were paying lip service to gender pay reporting. Their responses agreed with much of my fellow panellists have already said, that we are making progress in paying people more consistently. However, they did point out quite a major insight, that actually their main concern was about the exclusive nature of gender pay reporting and the bias towards women. What about the rest of the protected characteristics? Perhaps one of them offered to me as a piece of advice, this is just a bit of old-fashioned tokenism, habit, time to change tack perhaps. When I look internationally, and again my company is an Indian-based company, this is also a semi-picture I see as well. That India, USA, France and some other developed nations are now more concerned with the gap between the top and the bottom of the organisation closing. And particularly in Norway and other countries, this whole thing about pay and where do I fit against everybody else is just a non-issue because of complete pay transparency, for instance, Norway. I think the second lesson I draw our attention to is thinking about, is gender pay and the whole equality debate a topic that normal Joe public understands and recognises? After more than 40 years, published statistics continue to report this significant gender pay gap. The CIPD suggests that reasons for this are many and complex and include historical notions about men being the breadwinner in the family, needing higher pay as a result, women gravitating towards certain jobs, especially those which can accommodate part-time working, and obviously, as we've already previously discussed, women missing out on promotion opportunities, perhaps due to maternity reasons. Despite websites like Unison's, which actively encourage people to engage them to ensure that they are getting what they are entitled to, by dangling carrots such as 6 years' worth of lost earnings and employment tribunal claims are still stubbornly low. Recent statistics say that equal pay claims are still around 10% of the overall employment tribunal workload. So I believe there may be a couple of reasons for this. Obviously, employers are improving the consistency in the way that we're paying, but I think perhaps there's a second reason about it's perhaps in our makeup, that we expect difference, we look for difference. It's a little like when you go to buy a car. The more features and benefits it gives you, the higher price you'll expect to pay. My third lesson is to some of my other learned speakers' points. Janet and Chris have said, actually, have we given business the challenge that actually it can't solve? So my point here is, has government been really clear with business about the role it's expecting it to play? In my experience, this is probably the most hard issue to really crack for business. It has so many other things to think about. Looking at all the things that have been in the press recently, we've had the BHS, we've had Tata Steel, we've had all the discussions about Brexit and everything else. There is a raft of things for business to think about. Also, in my experience again, carrots usually work better than sticks when adopting change. The Birmingham City Council case has unfortunately sent a chill down the back of most of industry. And now it's the turn of supermarkets. Who else? I believe in the symbiotic relationship between employer and employee. Throughout my career, I've been a little bit unusual compared to some of my reward friends, that I believe wholeheartedly in communication and engaging employees in this discussion, in this debate. Perhaps one of the outcomes of these cases is for employers to be clearer about what they expect of roles and how they value that. From a government's point of view, although the spirit of equal value, equal pay legislation is being upheld, the ability for somebody to choose a random role and cite it as a comparator to give business expensive and perhaps unexpected surprises is disappointing, even when business have acted in good faith. I also very much agree with Janet's points earlier about the methodology of the gender pay reporting. When I analysed my company's results against this, the results didn't tell me anything I didn't already know. Of course, I'm paying males differently to females. However, to the points made earlier, the devil is in the detail, so to speak. The methodology compares secretaries to junior engineers, marketeers against IT developers, salespeople and data entry clerks against junior managers. I think by putting everybody together in this way is perhaps a little unhelpful. Chris has already picked up the point very well about there's a lack of frameworks. Method is detached from reality about how business really operates. When I design pay systems, I do the complete opposite of what this gender pay reporting methodology is suggesting that we do. I separate people out into different parts of the workforce, and I really try to understand those characteristics very well. I understand this in two ways. First of all, I appreciate that job evaluation has fallen out of favour a little in the recent past. I spoke to a fellow HR professional last week and she said, job descriptions are so yesterday. I was really disappointed in that, and that actually from my personal point of view at the moment, as Chris will testify, is that I'm very busy in implementing a job evaluation system where I'm actually encouraging employees and their managers to sit down and agree what their role is and get some really good role clarity. Having those adult to adult discussions is absolutely fundamental. And for me, job evaluation then sort of levels the playing field for everybody. It's about the role, not the person. And it really does understand what the role is contributing to the company, what the company's strategy is, how that role fits into that heartland. The second thing I do is look at the pay system. That there isn't a one-to-one relationship for me between job evaluation and the pay system. Job evaluation looks at contribution to the company and sort of puts in sort of an ordering there. Pay systems look at something completely different. And what I look at my pay systems for is, what is my company's approach to pay? Are we medium payers? Is cash king? Do we give great benefits instead of great pay? What about the non-financial sides? Great training. What's my company's reputation like? Am I known in the market? So what I'm really trying to say here is about the supply and demand of labour. How scarce is the skill set we need, and what am I prepared to pay for that? What are other companies paying in the talent market, and what are we already paying peers in the company? And belying all of this is, what can we afford to pay? So in conclusion, I would suggest we take action about gender pay, but I don't think the action that we're taking at the moment is going to give us the answers we're hoping it's going to. I'd return to my simple case that I talked at the beginning about dawn. Communication is often the key, and it seems to be a little bit missing here about communicating the right messages. I would reverse the trend and require companies to communicate to their staff how they value roles in the organisation. By writing down and publishing job evaluation policies and guidelines, you are being fair and transparent and upfront. Progressive companies involve their staff in determining this too. Secondly, I would require companies to disclose their procedures for setting pay levels. What do they take into account? How do they treat different segments of their workforce? And if that's going to be different, please declare that as why. Thirdly, I would limit legal recourse for equal pay, equal value. If a company has a job evaluation tool which has been discussed with the workforce, I would try and actively discourage other comparators being used too, and try and get internal mechanisms to work instead. In summary, as the equal pay legislation doesn't seem to have captured employee or business attention, I really don't believe that we've made the case for gender pay reporting well enough for today's society. Employees and employers are facing a number of challenges compared to the original ideals. Perhaps in taking a leaf out of auto-enrolment and the minimum wages legislation's approach to change, and how employment tribunals test if other practices are fair, perhaps we can find a way to ensure everyone earns the right pay which reflects their skills and experience, ensuring equality of opportunity but not necessarily of outcome. Thank you.
Also has extensive global HR experience in the area of remuneration and rewards. She's just joined, so my notes tell me, Aviva in February as the Group Talent and OD Director, and she's responsible for the attraction, development and engagement of your 35,000 staff, so you really have got it sure. And she's also doing a PhD in psychotherapy. Are you? That's very impressive to be able to combine those roles. So thank you and welcome.
Thanks very much, Stephen. So I'm going to begin by correcting you, if I may, actually, to say that I am not a reward expert, and I think that will come across, actually, in what I've got to say about this topic. But I'm very pleased to be here this evening, and I'm going to talk to you, actually, from a very pragmatic perspective as a practitioner, a talent practitioner, and I'm responsible at Aviva for how we attract, how we recruit, how we engage and develop, how we succession plan for our 34,000 employees globally. And I'm also going to speak to you as a working mother of 4. So when Keith engaged me to and talked to me about this event, I began to do a little bit of research, and there are some statistics here which I'm going to share with you, which I thought were really interesting, and you may question, I think, probably how they were, how the data was gathered, or indeed what exactly it means. But nonetheless, it is data I don't think that we can ignore. So this research undertaken by the EU in 2015 shows that women earn 16% less than men per hour in the EU. That for every 84 cents a woman earns in the EU, a man earns €1. And the older you get, the bigger the gender pay gap becomes. 60% of university graduates in the EU are women, so it's not that men are more educated than women. And across the EU, women are underrepresented in decision-making positions, particularly in politics and business. And therein lies the rub, actually, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I think in addition to that, actually, the UK's gender pay gap is actually, do you think it's higher or lower than our EU 16%? What do you think, higher or lower? Lower. Okay. Well, it's actually higher. It's 19.1%. And for every pound a man earns, a woman earns 81 pence. The impact on less money now means less money later, as women are able to save less into their pensions, and there is, as a result, a 39% pension gap between men and women in the UK. Now, of course, well, what causes this imbalance? And, the statistics, damn statistics, you can look at the data in different ways, but there is a difference here. And why is that? Well, underrepresentation of women, particularly in decision-making roles and positions, are multiple and complex and call for a comprehensive approach to tackle a situation. And that's something that I'm responsible for in my role, which looks at diversity and inclusion. We have to recognise that women do more unpaid work than men. And of course, women take career breaks for caring responsibilities more than many men do. And in my own experience, with 4 children, I didn't take full maternity leave for any of my children. But when my eldest actually was taking her A-levels, she was having some difficulties, and I took a career break of a year. When I tried to go back into the workplace, I wasn't able to get, and there may be a number of reasons for this, of course, but I wasn't able to get a comparable job at a comparable level. As a result, I took a job a level lower with 30% pay cut. It took me 10 years to get back up to where I was before. So that's my experience. But one of the issues with gender pay reporting, and there are several actually, as had been mentioned by the other panellists, only examining basic pay rates through an overall median and mean gender pay gap figure will not provide employers with a full understanding of the underlying causes of pay gaps or why they exist. There will no doubt, of course, be inconsistency in terms of how the figures are calculated, which will not allow true comparison. Addressing the gender pay gap requires building a balanced pipeline with talent. And this needs to be balanced across the organisation, across roles, and at all levels. It's not an overnight fix, and it certainly won't be fixed by gender pay reporting. We need to think about the pools that we draw on, how we attract, how we recruit, making sure, as Chris mentioned, that we are hiring managers are trained in unconscious bias, that we have leadership who are able to be inclusive in the way that they treat their staff, in the way that they encourage all of our staff to develop. We need, of course, to include flexible working policies in the way that we manage and what we offer to our future employees. And that's not, for me, actually about family-friendly policies. That's about engaging policy. That's about creating policies which are suitable and offer a range of flexibility, regardless as to your age or whether you have a family or what your background is. Because actually, different people's requirements are different at different times of their lives. One of the things that I began to share actually with some of my colleagues here was the Guardia review. Has anybody heard of the Guardia review? Yeah, so some people are nodding here, but not everybody perhaps has. So just to share with you, actually, it's quite an interesting piece of research. So Jane Ann Guardia is the CEO of Virgin Money. And she published a report, a review actually, which she commissioned. She published it on the 22nd of March this year. And that was looking at the representation of women in senior management positions, particularly in financial services, where we know actually there's a real issue. The review recommends that financial services firms connect parts of their remuneration packages of their exec teams to gender balance targets. And in fact, there's a number of recommendations here. But actually my view is that for organisations, whether in financial services or not, need to look at a broad range of interventions to make sure that they build their balanced pipelines of leadership, that they have the right processes in place, actually, that Simon mentioned. So we need to make sure that policies and procedures are balanced and fair, that we are using comparable information and data when actually we're going through these processes. One thing to share with you, actually, that we have done in Aviva, and I'm not sure if you may have heard this, but Mark Wilson, our CEO, actually has just recently signed up to, he's the first CEO in FTSE 100 to sign up to the 30% club. So the commitment is to see a minimum of 30% of women on the executive committee. And we believe that this is a first step, an iconic first step, actually, in order to create and identify strong, capable women to strengthen our leadership pipeline. For me, actually, that's fundamental to actually addressing this overall gender pay gap. And I will conclude there because I'm sure you have some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. Well, we've got a wealth of material from our four speakers. We've now got, have we got 35 minutes or so for questions? So if you could just identify yourself and your organisation and the person you want to direct the questions to, we can start now. Thank you.
My name is Armand Ducci. I work for an organization called Principal of Mercer.
You might just want to speak up for the people behind you.
So the question is directed to all of you, really. In all but name, the Q word, quota, seems to be coming around, but it wasn't sort of specifically said. We seem to be saying that, yes, the government legislation is sort of maybe not offering all the answers that we want, because this is a much bigger problem. It's a cultural problem, it's a social problem, societal problem, so it's not going to just resolve itself overnight. But as your CEO has done, how many of the organizations, the top 100, or perhaps Chris might be able to help, was there a set of questions in your survey to ask as to the number of women in high-level decision-making within your company, because there underlies the idea of unconscious bias and so on and so forth, and the rest of these decision-making sort of under carpet sort of stuff that goes without us knowing to be unconscious. So
Yeah.
Was there a lack of decision making? Was there a sort of part of your survey that perhaps didn't ask the question how many people were in the survey that asked the
Well, we were particularly focused in the study around people's response to the gender pay gap. But so I do have some answers to something which might be close to what you're after. But I'll add in some other experience to that before. Michelle, I'm sure you've got some comments on this one. So when we asked about organisations, what analysis they'd undertaken in the last 3 years, so have they suddenly picked up doing something, only 21% had actually set goals for female inclusion or representation. And then when we asked, okay, now you're more conscious of it, what are you thinking about doing forward? Let me see, where is it? We should be in here somewhere. Set goals for female inclusion and representation, 20%. So I don't see it doesn't make much, not making much of a change. Now, one of the questions as well, though, is are quotas effective? I think there's a national sense of are we kind of doing well, which is reasonable, but it's more of a question for other panellists about how women would feel about being subject to a quota. And I know about quota in their organisations. I think if I could put myself into their shoes, I'm not sure I'd feel particularly kind of comfortable about it. There's a kind of a metaphor in there which I don't really want to go. However, there are certainly things that organisations can do to actually be addressing some of those issues to achieve an aspirational goal, as my own organisation has. For example, one leading FTSE 100 organisation I know takes the approach that when they're thinking about a pool of talent to be considered for promotion to a senior level, they will place women automatically in the pool, and women have to be argued out, and men have to be argued in, rather than doing in a everybody put their top candidates into the process type approach, in order to kind of counter kind of the natural tendency to think about, about the same people in those pools. The other thing I'll just reflect on is that organisations in our analysis of labour flow tending to respond to lower levels of female inclusion at the executive level by hiring in women. Levels of promotion of women are actually poor. And one of the major reasons is actually if you go down and do the analysis, so you've really got to dig into the detail, you see that there are certain roles which are feeder roles where decisions are taken which are detrimental to a woman's future career to get on the board. For example, maybe this is not the right time in her life to be able to kind of go abroad. I won't ask her about that opportunity to lead a business unit in China. Maybe she doesn't have the confidence to be able to take on a P&L, so maybe it's not good. Those kind of things happen, and a woman themselves can say, I don't feel I have that confidence. So there are things that kind of go on, and we find that women tend to take different roles to men at a key point in their career, which doesn't equip them so well to build the pipeline for talent. And I'd say, as you know, Michelle better than me, that if you bring in lots of people at a high level from outside, it's got a much higher risk of failure, hasn't it? So that's not good for business.
No, absolutely.
Michelle, do you want to respond?
Yeah, just add briefly. I mean, one of the things that we've done actually is to really try and understand what best practice looks like in this area. And we've looked at where we think best practice exists actually, and what organisations are doing in this space. And the organisations that do really well and have the best balanced senior women leadership are the organisations such as Unilever, Sodexo, and interestingly P&G. So all of those consumer organisations, and financial services is pretty poor actually. So we are not thinking of quotas, and that's not actually the Guardian Review recommendations either. But I think setting targets in terms of helping provide focus and understanding where you need to make the shift, whether that be deeper into the organisation when you have more data and metrics, and that's often another area actually which organisations struggle with. What do you measure? Have you got the metrics? Have you got the data? Have you got the transparency of that? Do you report on it? And those are all things that we are certainly considering at the moment.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm Anna from King's College. I was just wondering, you're speaking about metrics, and this is for the practitioners specifically. I was wondering whether, when you're looking at women, when you're looking at these cohorts that you mentioned, Chris, whether race and ethnicity is something that's taken into account as well. It's intersection with gender, or is that a different ballgame altogether? I was wondering what the practitioners think.
Do you want to start, Chris? Oh, sorry.
No, sorry. I thought
Well,
you were sitting back.
I'm happy to say kind of one comment. So very, very practical comment here. I recognise that Fraser was wanted me to kind of draw to a close when I was speaking, but one of the key things that I wanted to say about what would be helpful going forward is about making better, believe it or not, the business case for diversity and inclusion. Some of the fascinating statistics that have helped me learn about the diversity and inclusion connection with business performance is that it's genuinely about the diversity of talents, men and women, gay and straight, black and white, so on and so forth. So the research is fascinating in the States that the improvement in business performance through much more stronger diversity rather than just focusing on male-female diversity is a real, it's about threefold. So there's something very powerful there. My experience is most organisations don't go into the same degree of analysis, however, as they do with gender. And I suppose you can think that if the tip of the iceberg is gender pay reporting, it's easy and we're probably going to have to do it. And then not too many people are really looking underneath that. Beneath that, when it starts to get much more difficult because there's a paucity of data, most organisations don't really go there, which is a shame.
Yeah, I just say, so absolutely it is important, and in terms of business results, it's, gender will get you a little bit further forward, but actually if you really want to make the difference, it's about ethnicity, it's about LGBT, it's about really having true diversity in your leadership teams and across the organisation. And one of the reasons we're going to begin with gender UK targets is because that's where we've got the data. But obviously, as you go across geographies and international, then you've got issues actually both with the reporting of wider data and with how you measure it. But we have given what we've decided to do actually is begin with a two-pronged approach. So we've identified, if you like, the diversity and inclusion pillars that we're going to work with, and we've gone out with those to markets to say, you figure out what's the most important for you, and you identify your own targets, your top 2 to 3 targets that you think will drive the business forward for you, thinking about your customers, thinking about where the gaps are for you. And then in addition, actually, we'll have some overarching drivers, which will be about education, awareness, helping people really understand some of the issues around unconscious bias, women's leadership program, some things that you might expect. We're also looking at having a diversity and inclusion innovation lab or hackathon, so where we gather people from around the globe together and we identify a topic that we really want to work through together in a short period of time. So I think there's a number of different things you do, but I think it's definitely broader than gender.
This lady here, the gentleman about yes.
I was just interested, given that we're going to have this regime, what do you may think of it? What will the panel think about the fact that there's no penalty for employees at all? And do you have any views on the adequacy of the regulations themselves? I'm thinking in particular of the complete ambiguity exists in the definition of pay. Base pay is one factor, there's a lot more income that's unclear. And also, it seems to me that we're entrenching because the definition of pay for maternity pay is what you actually receive and not what your actual base pay is. You're entrenching a gap by definition because you're always going to have a proportion of women on maternity leave in a large organisation. So do you have any views on the adequacy of the regulations themselves? I have some serious concerns.
I agree with your serious concerns, and I was listening to the examples given there about how much more developed organisations, bigger organisations have got resources to get behind this. And I reflect about how inadequate I felt there with a company that's in growth mode, that is in some areas only 4 or 5 people in the country versus having thousands. And so I think organisations have got a variety of resources to throw at this. And if I think back to mine at the moment about how much I have to dedicate and think about all of this, I'm going to have to reprioritise something in order to get behind this equal pay, gender pay reporting, because again, the government is driving us down that way. And I think that when you have to re-divert resources behind this, you've got to put the case behind it to why you're doing it. And the case behind it I'm putting is purely a compliance one. And that when I'm putting a pure compliance case behind this, because people are in very different places, as I've said in my few minutes there, about the case for it is not well made, and an organisation which is facing so many other priorities and so many other challenges at the moment, to get airtime with some of our executives about this would be really, really hard. So in some ways I'm really glad there's no penalty behind it. And the other ways I'm thinking I'm going to work really, really hard with our internal communications team to be able to explain this properly to people. And so I think that this is the key really, and talking with people as adults and putting the case to them and talking with them about the issue is equal priority as actually churning out the results.
Anyone else want to?
I mean, I suppose, two things. One is that there's a reputational risk element. So that's what I guess faces employers. I know in my own sector, the university sector, I think employers feel embarrassed about the reporting of gender pay gap statistics and so on, albeit that they're hugely problematic statistics. But nevertheless, there's I think that will preoccupy employers, I'm sure, and it's it's already leading to change and so on, and revaluations of pay systems and so on. I guess the thing that I find interesting is we've talked today about all the problems, and and the panel members are hugely insightful about that, and the government seem to be aware of the problems, and the House of Commons Select Committee. Very long report on this, and yet they're charging ahead, and actually they seem to want to deepen the regulations. My understanding is they want to actually extend it to firms of 50, small firms and so on, in time, 2 years after these regulations kick in. So I think that's it's worrying. It says something worrying about the articulation and enactment of government policy in this area. Particularly in light of what panel members have said about practicalities involved, and to a certain extent lack of buy-in.
Yeah, I'd echo that, and I think my concern in terms of what would be helpful going forward is actually, do we have to have a one-size-fits-all kind of regulation regime? If you have much larger organisations, they do have more resources, and they should be able to do more, and they should be expected to do more. Now, on one hand, we've got a situation where, all the years I've been involved in doing kind of equal pay work and things like that, I've been thinking to myself, well, why don't organisations do more of it? And it's because it's a poison chalice. Either you're going to be faced with having to spend more money to address the issue, or it's going to be okay. There is no upside. Actually, if you think about the diversity and inclusion agenda, actually there is a massive upside. So we're not actually really making that strong, business case that it leads to a better workplace, a better workforce, and better productivity. So I think if organisations are being so reluctant and the regulations are being so weak, then I think that there is a case for actually, particularly for larger organisations, more prescription being in place to help organisations to do the right thing, and to us to help them and for government to help them to do it in a way which will be beneficial for them. But at the same time, I think the government completely neglects the wider society thing and puts it all on employers and says, you're paying, you deal with it. Actually, that's rubbish, because it's got a whole load to do with how our education system, how girls and boys view careers and attitudes around that, the flexibility in the family, and how government can support that in lots and lots of ways. So I think it's reduced the debate and diminished it. However, as always, something is better than nothing. And it has garnered some more interest and more activity. So, I'll be grateful for that.
The gentleman up the back.
Hi, I'm Andrew from CLO. So we're a recruitment outsourcing organisation. We talk to our clients about all sorts of things, and we help them with all sorts of things about diversity. We need along all elements of that. Except I can't remember a single time when an organisation has had a conversation with us about gender pay discrepancy. I can't remember that has ever been in any conversation we've had. And we certainly don't work with every organisation, but we work with pretty much every industry sector. So I'm just wondering if the panel got any views about whether this issue filters down to a recruitment level or an operational level. My sense, and I might be wrong, that it doesn't do widely. And I would imagine that it's one element that an organisation needs to consider to fix some gender pay discrepancy if it had one. I just wonder if you have any views on that.
From my perspective, I advise managers most days of my working life about how to set pay for somebody in some sort of situation. And in my 13 years now of doing this, and in my 25 years in HR, I've yet to come across a manager which has applied any unbiased or deliberate bias towards setting pay. And so I completely accept, and it resonates what you're saying to me, is that I don't believe people go into any of these situations with any sort of conscious bias, and I genuinely believe that. I think that there is perhaps institutional discrepancies that are going on. I won't say discrimination because I don't believe it is. I just do believe that better frameworks and better monitoring and better processes at organisational level will help iron out some of those unintended consequences of things. And I look to the US and I look to France for guidance there. When I worked for a US organisation, there was a whole raft of people that were so conscious of litigation that they would just look at all my pay data, throw it through a statistical machine, tell me you need to pay her this, him that, do something else, and it was just done. So it wasn't even discussed, it was just rectifying the accidents of the institutional processes. So I think for me, I'm absolutely with you, that I think it's more at an institutional level than particular people and line managers.
Anyone else want to see that? Any further questions? Yes, Dr. Bain. Thank you.
I lead the EHRC and reward function at Labara, and we obviously started looking at our gender pay gap as well. And I work a lot with data, so I was doing a lot of going into detail and looking. And I realized that I'm a mother myself, and I realized that there's a huge cost involved in a woman to come back to work. So, childcare cost, the emotional cost, the flexibility of working around the child. So I don't know what's your view, or if there's any evidence that if organizations move truly towards flexible working, not on paper, truly flexible, where you're not forming like cultural change, where you are working virtually and flexibly, if there's any evidence of organizations having lesser gender pay gap, if they've done something like that.
I'm not sure that I can give you any research that correlates between more flexibility and less gender pay gap. What I can say to you is that those organisations who have better working practices, flexible working practices, have generally generally got targets and generally got a better percentage of their board which is at least female, if not ethnically diverse as well, actually. And those are all the organisations that I mentioned before, you know, the P&Gs, the academic users, the Sodexcos and so on.
Yeah, I think I haven't really seen those kind of data. What I do think is interesting to reflect upon, though, is how some of the small things actually can kind of resonate quite well. I had a meeting today with an organisation, and they were saying one of the things that they had done is they were finding that there was quite a negative bias about working from home. So once they called it remote working, it became resonant with modern working practices that were wherever you were. It wasn't tagged then as, oh, you know, they're looking after the child because they're sick kind of stuff. And I thought that was kind of quite interesting in terms of the small ways in which organisations can be inclusive. I'm very kind of reflective on some of the symbols that people pick up on and how they respond in organisations, and how organisations do that sometimes without thinking. So, but yes, I should look for the data for that.
I mean, I think that there is an issue. I actually was going to talk about that towards the end, but didn't want to go over time. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a very important issue in and around childcare provision, and in the UK it has historically been very expensive. Now, there have been improvements. I think over the past kind of 10 years have been attempts to roll out, preschool kind of provision and to assist on that. So, I mean, certainly, over my career, and I remember kind of struggling with, a young child and looking at kind of the expense of childcare, and it's a really difficult one. I mean, I still think that, I kept in full-time work despite huge nursery fees, but it's something that I think both men and women have to think about very seriously. I mean, what's interesting, and I think Europe's been mentioned in terms of kind of European comparisons, and you do find that there are certain kind of quite interesting countries that have a very low gender pay gap. So Italy has got a much lower gender pay gap than the UK, but actually it's got a much lower female labour force participation rate. I mean, only about 55% of women are actually in the workforce, are actually working, and the UK has got a much higher female employment rate, female labour force participation rate. So, I mean, again, I think comparisons. We're talking about company comparisons and things like that, but comparing across economies, this is again very complicated, and there's an awful lot of women who are not working in Italy, an awful lot of older women who are not working in Italy actually. So we need to take that into account too. But yes, your point about childcare provision is a very important one.
Gentleman after that, please.
Hi, Richard Linsell from Guncook. I'm an employment lawyer, and I share, first of all, I'd like to say, fascinating contributions from all the panel, and very refreshing to actually get some statistics. This is an area I felt I've been shouted down at employment law events by people who say, no, you've got to have transparency and that would solve all problems. And it just seems to me that the issues you've all said, that is actually about, it's the glass ceiling, it's the issues that stop women getting to the higher positions. That's really at the root of it. We talked about maternity being the real turning point in all of this, because particularly the statistic I think it was Janet who said that 22 to 9-year-olds is a negative. Actually, there's a gender pay gap for men. So it's clearly going to be the maternity issue. But I suppose my question is, do we think that there's ever a chance that the gender pay gap, or that real equality can be achieved, given that, for example, I said I speak from my experience of my wife and all of my friends, all of the women were the ones that they didn't take the maternity leave because they had childcare responsibilities. They took it because they wanted to. I wouldn't have wanted to take a year out to look after a baby. The women generally did. I'm sure that's a generalisation. I'm sure there are cases where men want to do it and women don't want to do it. But given that sort of natural affinity, what's the answer? Is there going to be this?
Well, I mean, what you're saying is really interesting, because if we look at Sweden, and Sweden's often held up as this kind of utopia for actually both women and men, and particularly if you want children, and they've got this extraordinary to me anyway, extraordinarily generous parental leave system, which I think you can take something like 400 days parental leave up to the age of 8 that child is.
And split between the parents.
And you can split it. But there again, in Sweden, more women than men take extended, parental leave. So, that's interesting where you're, faced with that kind of system.
So we're saying we can't defeat biology?
Well, I mean, surveys have asked, women, do you want to take up parental leave? Would you like your partner to take parental leave? And actually, women tend to say they'd like to take parental leave. They're uncomfortable with having their male partners take it all. So, there are interesting issues there. And it goes, choices are not all constrained. I mean, women and men do make choices, and, that's kind of interesting set of questions, I think, that you're raising. So, just in brief, probably not then. I mean, probably over the long term, we may see a reduction in the gender pay gap, kind of even more for full-time women and men, but I don't think we'll see its complete elimination. And I still think, although we talk a lot about the issue about getting women on boards, highly qualified women and talent progression, and I agree with you. I think those are really important issues. But if we're talking about the gender pay gap, the big pay gap is with part-time women. And it's a big pay gap between part-time women and full-time women. It's something like 32%, not 9%, 32%. That's quite a whopping big gap we're talking about there. And the government, I think, and when you look at all these official reports, is almost silent on what to do about part-time women, because it's a really difficult issue. I think the national living wage will help, but, they talk about vague things about increasing productivity growth. But how do you do that with women working in care, in the care sector, the home care sector? Yeah. What does productivity mean in some of these roles and occupations? I think it's a kind of really problematic argument that somehow they're going to enhance women's productivity in a sense.
I think there's some issues there about making sure we're not kind of confusing different things, because I don't think it's about part-time, I think it's about the nature of work at part-time, because it's mostly to do with kind of low-paid professions. Yeah. So there's an issue of low pay, which is a slightly different thing. But to come back to the issue, there is no proprietary job evaluation system in the United Kingdom that is used by a major organisation today that equally values the contribution of men and women, I would say. Because in most job evaluation systems, and believe me, I've designed plenty over the time and operated them in a number of organisations, they don't tend to value the emotional and caring challenges that come with work of that type. Because as a society, traditionally, we've de-skilled that, and we don't consider it to be as valued as the things that are really valued on job evaluation schemes, which puts your position in the organisational hierarchy and values jobs, which is about impact, business results, problem solving. So there's a real big fundamental kind of thing going on there, which is kind of not talked about. But I don't think it will be properly solved. But if we start to talk about a gap for those parents that take leave to look after their family, at least that's some form of progress. Because actually the way it's been in the past is actually, when I had my children with my wife 15 years ago, there wasn't that much of a choice to be made. Hopefully there's a bit more of a choice now. There's more choice for my colleagues in Sweden, one of whom, the lucky swine, is indeed on paternity leave until the end of the year. And now hopefully that'll be better going forward.
Perhaps one last question from somebody? This lady, you did have to... No. I'm sorry, Graham?
Graham from King's College. I just wanted to ask the panel, particularly practitioners, how important you see the role of the law in changing pay. And there's been a lot of criticism of equal pay legislation traditionally because of structural weaknesses, wide defence, material defence practices. I just wondered if you thought that stronger law would be something which laws would do. You mentioned the broad tribunal cases and look at the impact of fees in terms of discrimination claims.
Absolutely.
Access to justice. It seems to be that it's actually making it more difficult to make claims rather than
Practitioners?
I think by the time that things get to tribunal claims, then something fundamentally has gone wrong. And that I don't believe that the basic premise for anybody coming to work is to do a bad job or to do somebody over on something or whatever else. So I look at more systemic frameworks behind that. And I do think that where we are talking about smaller organisations who with less resources and who basically are struggling to keep their business going and do more from their business, I do think that we can do more about, perhaps through legislative frameworks, through guidance notes, through other things. Again, I draw the comparison with auto-enrolment. I think the government has done a superb job with auto-enrolment. The setting up of the assistance through Nest and the setting up of those frameworks have absolutely allowed the smaller organisations without the wherewithal, the resources and everything else to make a superb job of that. And so I do think strong legislation which is reinforced with the rest of the tools like Nest and auto-enrolment has, then we can do some much better things there, because left to their own devices, businesses won't think about that themselves. And so I'm with you there, that if we're going to do this in a different way, then perhaps there are other pieces of legislation that we can look to where they've actually driven some sort of change.
All right, thank you. Thank you to our panellists and thank you to our audience. And can we also thank Denise for organising an awful lot of the activity, which is always behind the scene, and to Guy and Fraser, and to thank Kings for being part of our first activity with you, and I'm sure there'll be many more. So thank you very much, everybody. Next door is going to be food and wine and other drinks.
Just a couple of words before we...
and I was just going to also say, because you won't say this, if you want to use the toilets, you've got a hell of a long trek. You can imagine in a place like this, there are not many of them. You've got to go to the next level, which is the sort of equivalent of the back of this lecture theatre, and go along that corridor for about 300 or 400 yards, 200 yards, and you will find them. So they are located eventually along that corridor.
Thank you. Funny enough, they're through the geography department, but I'm not quite sure what that says. I'd just like to reiterate Stephen's excellent chairmanship of the debate panel, and also for the panel members for their contribution today. It's always a sign of a very good debate when there are more questions coming from the floor than we have time. So I hope you'll stay around, possibly if there are any questions for the panel as well. So could we just show our appreciation? Our next and final event of this particular season is on Wednesday the 6th of July. We're going to be at the Brand Exchange in the city. The topic of that particular event is around employee wellbeing, so it's themed really with a lot of what was coming out today. Its title of it is it an ethical or a commercial concern? So we have two speakers, Dr. Wolfgang Seidel, who is the Workplace Health Consulting Leader for Europe at Mercer's, together with Jay Brewer, who is the Head of Clinical Wellbeing at the Nuffield Health. So I very much hope you'll be able to join us on Wednesday the 6th. Now, we do have some refreshments, and you'll stay with us for a little while, just so we can continue the networking and the discussion. So thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you.